He says, I often find myself philosophically closer to my postmodern friends who do not share my faith than to Christian philosophers who do. Now I wonder, this myself, if this is as provocative as it's supposed to sound. On the whole, he paints a pretty tame picture of postmodernism. But tame as it is, I think there are problems with this perspective. This perspective has three central features, and each correlates with an admonition to Christian theologians. The first is about ontotheology, the second about metanarrative, and the third is about perspectivism. First, he says that while Christianity is deeply anti-ontotheological, Christian theology, nevertheless, has strong ontotheological tendencies. And this is a bad thing. Ontotheology is bad for three reasons. First, it sucks all mystery out of the world. Second, it wreaks havoc with piety. And third, it paves the way for despotic control of the environment and human persons through technology and other devices. Westphal explains Martin Heidegger's concept of ontotheology in two stages. At the entry level, ontotheology is nothing more than the innocuous idea that there is a highest being who is the key to the meaning of the whole of being. This much Christianity rightly confesses. At the next stage, however, we learn that there is more to ontotheology than this, something that is more sinister. Quote, ontotheology occurs when philosophy allows God to become a theme of its discourse on its terms and in service of its project. In other words, philosophy's project is to render the whole of being fully intelligible to human understanding, to have the world at its disposal, first conceptually and then practically. The bottom line is that ontotheology involves an inappropriate human posture toward the sacred. Now I want you to notice that this perspective, this posture, begins with an attitude that is fundamentally epistemological. It presumes to domesticate the sacred through classification and analysis, resulting in an exhaustive knowledge of reality. Westphal warns against a slide into system building in the ontotheological sense, where all of our questions about God and His relationship to the world have been answered neatly and to our everlasting satisfaction. This slide may happen even in spite of our determination to submit philosophical analysis and the exegesis of an authoritative word from God as we find in the Bible. This, it seems to me, is a legitimate warning. However, I doubt that Heidegger is needed to make it seem more compelling than it should be on a straightforward understanding of Scripture and Christian history. And repairing to Heidegger is just as likely to confuse the believer about where knowledge of the sacred leaves off and mystery begins. As Lawrence Paul Hemming writes, for Heidegger, all theologies reduce God to the kind of commodity that technology routinely manipulates. Theology thereby becomes diabology. It is difficult to pin down the precise nature of Heidegger's atheism. It is partly because he is so skeptical about the possibility of any knowledge about God. But there is no question that he is radically opposed to all theologies. The most serious risk in following Westphal's anti-ontotheology is that it will foster a lassitude in theological reflection that is unbecoming to creatures made in the image of God, capable of a knowledge of God, and who are the object of God's desire to be known. Why would God bother to reveal Himself if God cannot be apprehended by His creatures? And if God can be apprehended at all, then there is a place for theology, and we must have an appropriate account of how our knowledge of God is possible and can be developed. Of course, there's plenty we'll never know, and there are questions we'll never resolve. But Heidegger's particular conception of ontotheology, so essential to Westphal's critical perspective, is inimical to even the most minimal of knowledge claims about the divine. And if Westphal believes that God can be known at all, then it would be helpful to have him explain how Heidegger's critique of theology can be taken seriously by Christian theologians without also becoming disillusioned with the very possibility of theological knowledge. Second, Westphal warns that Christian theology has a misguided tendency to regard its perspective as a meta-narrative, in the sense of a totalizing project that is inherently illegitimate. In certain respects, Lyotard's concept of meta-narrative parallels Heidegger's idea of ontotheology. But with the concept of meta-narrative comes the idea of a complete and final body of knowledge that can be worked out systematically, grounded in reason, and wielded as an instrument of violence against others. Westphal writes that Christian thought is not a meta-narrative in this sense. He allows that Christianity is a meta-narrative in the sense that it embodies a philosophy of history, a big story in which we place the little stories of our lives as individuals and communities, and encompasses all that runs from creation and the fall through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus to the second coming, the resurrection of the dead, and the life everlasting. But we're not told what it means to call Christianity a big story. We're not told whether the story is true, whether God is our story of Him. Westphal says nothing about the conditions for knowing this story to be true. He does not say even whether it can be known to be true. For that matter, he does not say that it is true. Instead, he draws three contrasts between the big Christian story and its transformation into a meta-narrative in Lyotard's sense. First, as kerygma, the Christian story is opposed to apologetics. Second, it originates in biblical revelation and not philosophy. And third, it legitimizes only one kingdom, the kingdom of God, and delegitimizes every human kingdom, including the kingdoms of Western modernity that seek hegemony in the world and expect the final state of God's kingdom to resemble their own. Postmodernists have a curious penchant for talking about story. Notice this is the category most frequently used by postmodernists when talking about the enterprise of theology. But what is the point of calling the faith once for all delivered to the saints, Jude 3, a big story? Stories may be regarded as in some sense compelling, even if they are not believed. But the Christian story is presented as kerygma, and thus it is offered as something to be believed. The goal of biblical kerygma is conviction that certain things are true, the production of a knowledge of the truth, and with that, salvation. St. Paul speaks of this in 2 Timothy chapter 2. Thus, kerygma is not opposed to apologetics, as understood as rational persuasion of the truth of Christianity. We have the example of Jesus in the Gospels and the apostles in the book of Acts, for whom the preaching of the gospel was repeatedly accompanied by an appeal to reason and evidence to support his claims. As St. Peter remarked, the believer has a reasonable hope that is so attractive that he or she must be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks for a reason for that hope. Does kerygma originate in biblical revelation? Certainly kerygma is known through divine revelation. And this revelation includes the Bible, the historical presence of Jesus Christ in the world, and the whole panoply of creation is God's handiwork, plus whatever can be discerned about God and His existence, His character, His intentions from His providential oversight of the events of human history. All of this and more is data for the theologian to support, to sort out, and to systematize a coherent, unified, and plausible account of reality that is more than just a big story. The kerygma, the gospel that is preached, can thus be preached in such a way that it is seen to be the good news that it is, God's true story about reality. Third, Westphal worries that Christian theologians have a tendency to regard themselves as the privileged repositories of absolute truth. Postmodernism chastens this tendency with its emphasis on perspectivism. Perspectivism, says Westphal, is a unifying aspect of the postmodernisms of Nietzsche, Heidegger, Derrida, Foucault, and Rorty. In some sense, we are to believe perspectivism is a good thing. So what is postmodern perspectivism, and what are its virtues? The basic point, says Westphal, is that we are not God. We do not occupy an absolute, all-encompassing point of view, but see instead what whatever we see, including right and wrong, from a particular standpoint. It's constituted to a certain degree by contingencies of linguistic use and socio-historical location. Perspectivism, he allows, is a form of relativism, but only in the sense that our insights, whether they be factual or normative, are relative to the standpoint from which they are made, and that the standpoint we occupy inevitably betrays that it is not an absolute standpoint, an all-inclusive, totalizing point of view that sees everything and is blind to nothing. I think there are problems with the perspectivism sanctioned by Westphal. I wanted to speak about two. First, what are we to make of the fact that the Christian theologian does not occupy an omniscient standpoint? Even though we do not occupy an omniscient standpoint, there is a God who does. And this God is in the business of revealing truth to his epistemically fallible creatures. Second, what is the basis for Westphal's own assurance that postmodernists go too far when they deny the existence of God? Why, according to him, should one be a theist rather than an atheist? Even the mitigated perspectivism that says only that we who are not God occupy a socially conditioned standpoint must be able to transcend that standpoint to some degree in order to judge that atheism is beyond the pale. You don't have to be a postmodernist or find anything attractive about postmodernism to confess that we do not occupy some privileged perspective from which we see everything and are blind to nothing. Postmodernity's peculiar way of making this point, I think, is inimical to the very idea that we do see some things, that knowledge is possible even when our knowledge is partial. Postmodernists go over the top, not only when they deny that there is some absolute point of view, namely God's, but also when they talk about the relativity of our own standpoint, as if it is so radically socially conditioned that we don't actually know anything that is objectively true. Fallibilism is not by any means a uniquely postmodern distinctive. On the contrary, postmodernism cherishes a distinctive form of fallibilism that more closely approximates epistemological nihilism. Postmodernism falters in its diagnosis of our cognitive limitations. Westphal says, instead of running in terror from perspectival relativism, we should look it in the face to see whether it can be read as a commentary on the limitations of our insight due to our finitude and fallenness. Now, I stress the last part of his remark to draw attention to the fact that his counsel assumes Christian knowledge about the human situation that is denied by the postmodernist he regards as useful in the quest for theological knowledge. They know nothing of our fallenness or even of our finitude in the Christian sense of those terms. We are God's creatures, our existence is contingent, and thus we are finite. Furthermore, we have twisted wills that find expression even in our attempts to acquire non-accidentally true beliefs, and so our fallen wills prevent us from having perfect knowledge. Really? 5 minutes? These are not categories to which the postmodernists as such can appeal in counseling restraint. The biblical diagnosis of human cognitive failure is so much richer, not only for the truth that it tells about our limitations, but also for its optimism about the possibility of knowledge, despite those limitations themselves. So I conclude that Westphal's appeal to postmodern frameworks in epistemology is inherently risky and needs to be counterbalanced with an account of theological knowledge that must be repudiated by the postmodern. An appropriately modest version of foundationalism is much better suited to the goals of Christian theology. At least that's my view. Now, John Franke is a critic of foundationalism who thinks there is an alternative that serves better the purposes of Christian hermeneutics. He understands postmodernism as an attempt to rethink the nature of rationality following the demise of foundationalist epistemology. And he welcomes the non-foundationalist turn, as he calls it, thinking that Christian theologians would do well to reconstruct theology along non-foundationalist lines. What unifies the different permutations of postmodernism is its critical agenda, namely, he says, the rejection of the central features of modernity, such as its quest for certain, objective, and universal knowledge, along with its dualism and its assumption of the essential goodness of knowledge. He doesn't take the time to explain what he means by universal knowledge, dualism, and the essential goodness of knowledge. We would like to know what these terms refer to before we're asked to agree that what they refer to is bad. But apparently, as a package, they represent a pretentious form of rationality that must be replaced by something more modest, something he finds more acceptable. And so he builds a case for a chastened rationality. Such a rationality will abandon a realist view of truth in the world in favor of a constructionist view of truth in the world. Now, it's very difficult to tell in Frankie's perspective what he means by this contrast between a realist and a constructivist view. On the one hand, you might think that there is a real way the world is, and then there is a world as constructed by us that stands in some special relation to it. But then that might not be any approximation to the actual world. On the other hand, it might approximate it more or less adequately, in which case we need criteria for determining how plausible our construction is. A more radical interpretation of Frankie would have it that there is no way the world really is, objectively speaking, and that all there are constructions. One of the great problems with this view is that he's unclear about which of these things it is. But if it is the former, more modest view of a relation between realism and constructionism, then he needs a theory of epistemic justification that would explain how you make the distinction between the real world and the world that's constructed, and how you make judgments about which world that is constructed more closely approximates the way things really are. He also believes that a chastened rationality of postmodernity, that is the view that he commends, entails the rejection of epistemological foundationalism and the adoption of a non-foundationalist and contextual approach to the theological enterprise. Now, here's what he says, and this quote, I think, reveals how little in touch he is with the nature of foundationalism and its alternatives. You see, he is attracted to a postmodernism because he rejects foundationalism, but this is what he thinks it is. That is what he thinks foundationalism is. At the heart of the foundationalist agenda is the desire to overcome the uncertainty generated by the tendency of fallible human beings to error and the inevitable disagreements and controversies that follow. Foundationalists are convinced that the only way to solve this problem is to find some means of grounding the entire edifice of human knowledge on invincible certainty. Now, this is not essential to foundationalism. The foundationalist simply holds that there are things we are justified in believing through direct acquaintance with the world, and other things we're justified in believing on the basis of those beliefs that we acquire that way. This does not require certainty or an absolute, unqualified point of view. It gives us certainty of an invincible sort. But he makes the mistake of thinking it is, and then thinks that he must dispense with foundationalism and go with something more contextualist. And so really the biggest problem here for him is that he misunderstands the modesty that is possible within a foundationalist perspective. My basic concern with all of these perspectives is just that neither Westphal, nor Frankie, nor any other advocate of a postmodern point of view has a plausible theory of epistemic justification. No theory according to which this or that belief is more likely to be true than some other belief. And within Christian hermeneutics, we want a theory of that sort, or there's little point in applying any hermeneutic because there's little point in believing, as we do, that a Christian perspective is more plausible than any other. So my challenge has always been, what is it, according to the postmodernist, or anybody who adopts any framework of hermeneutics, what is it that you think it is that makes any belief more likely to be true than something else that that is not consistent with that belief? So I hope that our discussion can focus on that as an essential concern within hermeneutics, how we manage the project of knowing anything that we think we know.